What if the only thing that stood between a forgotten inheritance and a junk heap was a dog who never forgot a scent? Out in the sunburned desert outside Albuquerque, a struggling Marine veteran named Evan received an envelope thick with dust and trouble. People in town whispered that the salvage yard he had inherited was worthless. Everyone dismissed it, everyone except his German shepherd. Atlas planted his paws firmly on the earth, nose fixed toward a wall of corroded cars, and refused to budge. Behind that barricade of rust lay a locked door, 3 padlocks deep, hiding engines that once ruled the skies. Men in pressed suits wanted the land. Time wanted the rest. But the dog remembered. What unfolded next would test loyalty, ignite second chances, and uncover miracles buried in plain sight. Before the story begins, let me ask, where are you watching from? Type your country in the comments below, and hit subscribe if you believe no courage should ever be forgotten. The afternoon sun stretched long golden arms across Albuquerque, painting cracked stucco storefronts and fading neon signs along Central Avenue with a nostalgic glow. The dry air smelled of sagebrush and the dust drifting from the Rio Puerco. The Sandia Mountains loomed in the distance, watchful but cold, their silent peaks offering little comfort to a man drowning in unpaid bills. Evan Rook stood inside his weathered auto repair garage, grease smudging his hands, sweat darkening the collar of his shirt, his posture burdened with fatigue. He was in his late 30s, body still carrying the unmistakable shape of a Marine, broad chest, disciplined stance, a back that stayed straight even in exhaustion. His face bore the wear of too many fights, a square jaw covered in stubble, storm-gray eyes that had seen too much, and worry lines carved deeper by debt than by age. He had survived deployments overseas with the Marine Corps, battles that tested his resolve. But the fiercest enemies had followed him home, crushing loneliness, creditors calling at every hour, and nights echoing with silence in a house that felt too empty. The garage, once lively with customers and steady work, was now a husk of its former self. The shelves were cluttered, the tools idle. A cracked vinyl chair in the corner served only as a place where Evan unfolded overdue notices, each one bleeding with red ink like open wounds. On the workbench sat an unopened envelope. Its seal bore the old-fashioned wax insignia of a law office, a weighty kind of letter, the kind that carried either salvation or ruin. Evan's gut told him it contained more than just another bill. He ran a calloused hand through his short chestnut hair, streaking grease across his temple, and stared at it. At his feet lay Atlas, his 6-year-old German shepherd. Atlas's sable coat shimmered with streaks of silver under the shop's dim light. One ear stood tall while the other bore a permanent bend from an old injury, giving him an oddly regal yet approachable look. His amber eyes were sharp, vigilant, always restless. Atlas wasn't just a dog. To neighbors he was a protector, but to Evan he was a compass, a living reminder that loyalty still existed in a world where everything else seemed to corrode. The German shepherd had been by Evan's side since the final days of his service, following him home from a deployment and through every storm since. Atlas lay calmly, but the moment Evan touched the sealed envelope, the dog's ears flicked forward, as though sensing a shift in fate. Evan broke the wax and unfolded the heavy paper. The letter came from Porter and Hale, attorneys whose name brought an ache to his chest. Harold Porter, one of the partners, had once been his mentor, a Korean War veteran who had guided Evan when he left the Marines. Porter had spent his last decades running a junkyard on the outskirts of the desert. To outsiders, it was nothing but rust and ruin. To Porter, it was a sanctuary, a place to rescue what still had value. The letter confirmed Porter had passed away. And by his will, Evan was to inherit Porter Salvage, a 46-acre yard of scrap on the Rio Puerco. He had 30 days to claim it formally. Evan set the letter down, disbelief rippling through him. Why would Porter, who had drifted distant in later years, leave him such a burden? And what good was a graveyard of broken steel when his own life was collapsing? The smart move was obvious: sell the land, pay off what he could, and get creditors off his back. But Atlas had other plans. The shepherd rose, stretched, and trotted to the tool bench. He grabbed Evan's truck keys from a peg, carried them across the shop, and dropped them at his boots. Then he sat, tail thumping once, gaze fixed. Not a demand, an order. A signal. Move. Evan crouched, looking into those insistent amber eyes. He had seen that look before, in the field, from men who refused to let him hesitate. He sighed, picked up the keys, and muttered, "Fine, boy. Not everything is your call." Yet even as he said it, he knew Atlas had already won. They locked the garage, climbed into Evan's battered pickup, and drove west into the desert. The neon glow of the city gave way to vast plains of sage and cactus, the air thick with heat and dust. For the first time in weeks, Evan felt a flicker of possibility. Atlas sat upright in the passenger seat, nose pressed out the window, ears shifting as though he heard whispers hidden in the wind. When they reached the gate of Porter Salvage, the red paint on its sign was faded almost to nothing. Evan unchained the entrance with the key provided in the letter and drove inside. Before him stretched rows of decaying vehicles, stacked in rusting towers, casting jagged shadows in the evening light. "This is what he left us," Evan muttered bitterly. 46 acres of junk. Atlas leapt from the truck, tail stiff, posture alert. Then he froze, nose high, body rigid. A low growl rumbled, not of threat, but of discovery. Suddenly, he bolted, weaving between the skeletal frames of trucks and sedans until he reached a wall of stacked cars. He barked sharply, pawing at the seams where metal met metal. Evan hurried after him, the hairs on his neck prickling. He pressed his hand against the sun-baked steel and felt a strange chill. A faint scent lingered, not rust, not decay, but the clean tang of preserved oil, sealed away for decades. Something was hidden here. The next morning, Evan returned with Atlas. The desert sky was a flawless dome of blue, the sandiest glowing pink with dawn. Atlas led him again to the same wall of stacked cars. Nearby stood a decrepit forklift, its paint sun-bleached and peeling. To Evan's surprise, the key still hung in the ignition. He tried it, and the machine sputtered to life, coughing before settling into a steady rumble. Slowly, Evan maneuvered the forks and began moving the barricade. Steel groaned, dust filled the air, and one by one the hulks shifted until a narrow passage revealed itself. Beyond lay a corrugated steel building, oddly untouched by the years. Its walls stood solid, its door locked with 3 heavy padlocks. Evan's hand trembled as he tried the brass keys from the lawyer's envelope. One by one, the locks surrendered. With a deep breath, he shoved the door. Hinges moaned, and darkness swallowed him. The smell hit first, oil, canvas, metal. He fumbled along the wall until he found a switch. Fluorescent lights buzzed to life. And then he saw them. 3 titans slept under heavy canvas covers. Their outlines alone betrayed their nature, warbirds. The first, slender, elegant, AP-51 Mustang. Evan tugged the canvas to reveal gleaming aluminum, polished bright as a mirror. Painted faintly on its side were the words Molly's Promise. His throat tightened. This was no scrap, this was living history. The second, bulkier, stranger, its twin fuselages joined by a single wing. Evan uncovered its markings, Night Sparrow. AP-82 Twin Mustang. Rare beyond measure, engines sealed in cosmoline as though waiting for resurrection. The third loomed at the far end. Its dark navy paint still glistened. Twin propellers. White stars on the fuselage. A modified F-7F Tigercat prototype, experimental, its presence commanding reverence. Atlas circled the aircraft, sniffing carefully, before sitting between them with a low whine, as if honoring old guardians. On a nearby workbench lay a leather-bound ledger, filled with dates, part numbers, and notes written in Harold Porter's hand. In a drawer, Evan found a letter addressed to the one who would uncover the secret. I chose preservation, not profit. These machines are not junk. They are courage given form. Do not melt them down into forgetfulness. Guard them, as they once guarded us. Evan sat heavily, the letter trembling in his hands. Porter had not left him ruin. He had left him a charge. Atlas padded over and rested a paw against the Mustang's polished wheel. Evan placed his hand on top of it, whispering, "I won't sell. Not until I understand." For the first time in years, purpose sparked in his chest. The desert had delivered him not ruin, but destiny. The midday sun pressed down on Albuquerque, shimmering heat waves rising from asphalt roads. Back at the salvage yard, Evan spent the morning reinforcing the gates and checking the locks on the hangar 3 times over. He had barely slept. Harold Porter's words about guarding courage replayed in his head like a warning. Atlas sensed it too. The shepherd paced restlessly, ears twitching at phantom noises, amber eyes always scanning. Late in the day, the sound of tires crunching gravel broke the stillness. A sleek black sedan rolled to a stop outside the gate. Its polished surface gleamed unnaturally against the backdrop of rust and dust. The driver stepped out with calculated grace, his tailored suit untouched by the desert wind. "Mr. Rook," the man called smoothly, offering a smile that never reached his eyes. "Name's Graham Vale." He was in his early 40s, tall and lean, hair slicked neatly back, wrist flashing with a gold watch. Everything about him spoke of boardrooms and backroom deals, not scrapyards. "I heard about your good fortune," he continued, voice dripping with practiced charm. "Quite the windfall, inheriting this place. Must feel like a blessing." Evan narrowed his eyes. "Fortune depends on perspective. Most people call it a junkyard." Vale chuckled lightly, showing perfect white teeth. "One man's junk, another man's legacy. But let's be direct. I represent investors who'd like to acquire this property. They're willing to pay far above market value, cash, no strings. Enough to clear debts and put you back on your feet." Atlas stepped forward, hackles raised, body stiff. His amber eyes locked on Vale like a warning. Vale glanced at the dog, the smile on his lips twitching before he returned his gaze to Evan. "I'm not interested," Evan said flatly, arms crossed. Vale tilted his head, feigning surprise. "You may want to reconsider. Land like this, especially on the edge of development zones, carries hidden value. And maintaining certain contents could prove costly. Even dangerous." His voice lowered, conspiratorial. Evan's pulse spiked. Vale's choice of words was too precise: contents, hidden, dangerous. He forced his expression neutral. "All I see is rust and sunburn." Vale's smile sharpened. "Think about it. My offer won't stay on the table forever." He slipped back into his sedan, tires kicking up dust as he disappeared toward the highway. Atlas growled until the sound faded, then trotted back to the hangar doors. He pawed at the ground, nose pressed low. When he returned, he carried a frayed strip of fiberglass reinforced tape in his mouth, the kind used by locksmiths and saboteurs. Evan turned it over, noticing the chemical scent of solvents. His gaze flicked to the padlocks. Fresh scratches. Someone had tried them. The message was clear, Vale knew. And he wouldn't stop. That night Evan sat at his kitchen table, Porter's ledger open but unread. Atlas lay at his feet, growling softly in his sleep. Near midnight, the crunch of gravel snapped Evan awake. Atlas was already standing, teeth bared. Flashlight beams cut across the junkyard. Evan grabbed a torch and slipped outside, the shepherd at his side. Shadows darted between rusted cars. The beam paused at the hangar door, then slipped inside through a gap in the tarps. From where he stood, Evan saw the light fall across polished aluminum. The P-51's tail number glowed for a split second before the intruder jerked the beam away. They knew. They had seen enough. Atlas barked, a thunderous warning that shattered the silence. The flashlight swung wildly, then vanished into the night. Evan sprinted toward the hangar, but by the time he reached it, the intruder was gone, swallowed by the labyrinth of steel and desert dark. Breathless, he stood with Atlas at his side, the truth heavy in his chest. The secret was no longer secret. The following days brought little rest. Evan lived on black coffee and nerves. Atlas grew more restless, ears pricked at every sound. Evan knew he couldn't guard this alone. He made 3 calls. The first was to Tom Bradley, a mechanic he'd known since his Marine unit had worked alongside Air Force ground crews in Nevada. Tom was in his late 60s now, his hair thinning, his build stocky, his hands thick and scarred from decades of engine work. He had lost his only son in a training accident years back, and since then had carried a fatherly protectiveness for younger veterans. The second call was to Dorothy "Red" Alvarado, a legend in New Mexico's aviation circles. 83 years old, wiry and sharp, her hair once copper now silver. She had flown during World War II as a WASP, ferrying fighters across states when the military was desperate for pilots. She had lost friends in silence, and that loss had hardened her into a firebrand. Her rasping voice still carried wit and authority enough to silence men twice her size. The third was to Nora Chen, a graduate student at the University of New Mexico. In her late 20s, she specialized in aviation history, particularly the fate of surplus warplanes after 1945. Slender, with black hair usually tied back, glasses perched on her nose, and a quiet demeanor that turned fierce when discussing her research. Her professors called her relentless. When the 3 stood with Evan and Atlas at the hangar door, the desert sun was slipping low, painting copper shadows across the Rio Puerco. Dorothy knelt, scratching behind Atlas's bent ear. "You've got a nose like radar here, Rook. Best insurance policy I've ever seen." Inside, the fluorescent lights flickered to life. The 3 Warbirds gleamed like sleeping giants. Tom circled the Mustang, muttering serial numbers, fingertips brushing rivets as if they were scripture. Dorothy climbed onto the wing with surprising ease, her hand resting reverently on the canopy. Nora set up her laptop on a workbench, typing rapidly as she cross-checked serials against archives. Hours passed as they inspected. Tom tested fittings, Dorothy handled controls with muscle memory that had never left her, Nora traced paperwork back to auctions in the late 1940s. At last, Tom removed his cap, scratching his head. "These aren't replicas, Evan. They're real. Preserved better than I've ever seen. The Mustang alone is worth millions. The twin Mustang? Priceless. And this Tiger Cat variant, hell, I've never seen one like it outside prototype manuals." Dorothy nodded, eyes misting. "They're not dead. They're sleeping. With the right hands, they'll sing again." Nora looked up from her laptop, voice steady. "Conservative estimate? $15 to $20 million for the collection. But more importantly, these aren't commodities. They're national treasures." Evan swallowed hard, weight pressing down on him. Porter hadn't left him a junkyard. He had left him guardianship. Responsibility. Before he could speak, engines rumbled outside. Dust plumes swirled at the gate as 2 black SUVs rolled in. Graham Vale stepped out, smile wide, flanked by 3 large men in suits. Their movements were too precise for mere businessmen. One carried a suspiciously heavy briefcase. "Mr. Rook," Vale called warmly, spreading his arms as though greeting an old friend. "I've brought colleagues. Interested parties. We'd like to discuss a purchase." Atlas sprang forward, growling low, body taut with defiance. Tom moved closer to Evan. Dorothy crossed her arms, eyes flashing. Nora shut her laptop and stood straight. "This doesn't need to be difficult," Vale continued, his charm thinning, steel creeping into his tone. "Take the money. Walk away." "Not for sale," Evan said firmly. One of the suited men stepped closer. Atlas lunged, teeth bared, a growl vibrating the air. The man froze, uncertainty flickering. Nora's voice rang out, calm but sharp. The FAA registry confirms each aircraft was legally transferred into Harold Porter's civilian ownership in 1947. The documents are valid, still active. Any attempt to seize them would be theft. She turned her laptop screen, showing official records. And I've saved copies. Vale's smile faltered. His jaw tightened. Behind him, his men shifted uneasily. Atlas's growl deepened, daring them forward. The desert air hung heavy with silence until finally Vale raised his hand. Enough. We'll revisit this matter. He turned, his men following back into the SUVs. Dust rose as they retreated down the road. Evan exhaled sharply, only then realizing he'd been holding his breath. Atlas barked once, sharp and victorious. Tom shook his head. You've got sharks circling, Rook. And they smell blood. Dorothy spat in the dirt. Let them circle. They'll find teeth waiting. She ruffled Atlas's ears. Especially from this officer. Nora carefully packed her laptop. They won't stop. But neither should we. For the first time since inheriting the yard, Evan didn't feel alone. The week that followed blurred together, as if the sun rose and set in fast motion over the Rio Puerco. July's heat hammered the yard like a forge, yet inside the hidden hangar the rhythm of tools against steel never stopped. Evan, Tom, Dorothy, and Nora had come to a decision. If Porter's legacy was to be preserved, it wasn't enough to keep the hangar locked. They would have to restore the machines, bring them back to life, and make them impossible to dismiss. The first focus was Molly's promise, the polished P-51 Mustang. Under fluorescent lights, its fuselage gleamed as though it had been waiting decades for this moment. Tom, wiping sweat from his brow, ran his broad hand across the smooth aluminum. This one's a time capsule. Porter drained the fluids, sealed everything in cosmoline. It's like he knew she'd need to wake up one day. Atlas circled the plane, nose twitching at seams and rivets, tail stiff as if he understood the gravity of the work. Only when satisfied that everything smelled right would he settle by the tool chest, amber eyes tracking every move. The P-82 twin Mustang, Night Sparrow, was another matter. Its twin fuselages sprawled wide across the hangar floor, a double-bodied beast that promised twice the headaches. Tom groaned every time he eyed the tangle of linkages. 2 hearts, 1 body, she'll fight us every step. At the far end loomed the Tigercat prototype, its navy paint dulled but intact. Dorothy touched its nose cone with reverence. I only ever saw one of these in my life. Experimental, dangerous, fast. Your Porter wasn't a collector, he was a savior. The days found their rhythm. Tom and Evan worked wrenches and hoists, replacing seals, flushing old lines. Dorothy catalogued control surfaces, comparing them to her wartime memories. Nora kept meticulous records, typing part numbers, serial plates, and inspection notes into a growing database she swore would outlast them all. Atlas patrolled with soldierly precision. He sniffed every fuel line they opened, sitting abruptly when something was wrong. Twice he caught faint traces of cracked hoses that might have cost hours to find otherwise. When tempers flared, Tom cursing frozen bolts or Evan fighting rusted threads, Atlas padded over, resting his heavy head on a knee until grudging laughter broke the tension. One sweltering afternoon, a new helper arrived. Marlene Gutierrez, a retired machinist from Deming, had caught word through New Mexico's small Warbird community. Short and broad-shouldered, her arms thick with years of mill work, she wore patched denim coveralls and carried the reputation of someone who could turn a block of aluminum into precision parts. She shook Evan's hand firmly, then got to work at Porter's old lathe, whistling low as she cut new bushings. Good choice, Tom muttered approvingly. If we're racing time, we'll need her hands. The restoration became something larger than their circle. Packages began to arrive from across the Southwest, carburetors shipped from Arizona, manuals photocopied by enthusiasts in Texas, crates of rivets donated by a volunteer in Colorado. Letters often accompanied the parts. Please keep their memory alive, some read. Nora made a habit of reading them aloud, her voice trembling with each note. But not every delivery was a blessing. On the fifth morning, a delivery truck dropped off a long wooden crate labeled as a fuel injection pump assembly, the part they desperately needed for the twin Mustang. Tom opened it with surgeon's precision, only to find bricks of rusted scrap iron wrapped in brown paper. His jaw tightened. "This was supposed to be our lifeline," he growled. Evan checked the paperwork, everything matched, labels, weights, tracking numbers. Yet the contents were wrong, deliberately so. Atlas was already pacing, nose buried in the crate. He sneezed, barked sharply, then bolted out of the hangar, nose low to the ground. Evan and Tom exchanged grim looks before following. Dorothy muttered something about men needing a woman's sense, but her wiry legs carried her after them with surprising speed. The shepherd led them across the yard, past rusted carcasses, into a shallow arroyo. The smell of sage mixed with something harsher, burnt rubber and solvent. There, half buried in sand, lay the splintered shell of the real shipping box, its top slashed open. Inside, only torn packing material remained. Fresh boot prints surrounded the site, heavy-soled and deliberate. "Vale's men," Evan muttered bitterly. Atlas sniffed the debris, hackles raised, a low growl vibrating as though he had taken the violation personally. "Someone's watching us," Dorothy said, voice hard. "And they don't mind playing dirty." Evan clenched his fists, a cold resolve settling inside. They could sabotage shipments, send threats, even circle like vultures. But they wouldn't take Porter's legacy. Not while he and Atlas were standing. That night, under the dim glow of a single bulb, Evan opened Porter's ledger and scrawled a note at the back: "The fight is no longer about money. It's about honor, about memory, about keeping the sky alive." Atlas lay at his feet, ears twitching even in half-sleep, as though agreeing silently. The following morning brought no peace. The New Mexico sun climbed mercilessly, heat waves distorting the horizon. Atlas pulled Evan along, nose fixed like a compass needle. Tom trudged behind, denim shirt dark with sweat. They stopped at a patch of cracked earth near another arroyo. Atlas sniffed hard, pawing at the dirt. Fresh boot prints cut deep into the dust. Evan bent low, picking up a greasy rag half buried. It reeked of machine oil and solvent, the same smell from the sabotaged crate. They followed the trail across cactus and broken fence posts until a corrugated tin warehouse emerged, squat and ugly behind a half-collapsed fence. Evan recognized it instantly: Graham Vale's so-called storage facility. Vale had always seemed too polished for the scrap trade. His black hair was always combed, his slacks never dusty, his voice syrupy with salesmanship. But behind those sharp eyes, Evan had seen predatory calculation before, in war zones where opportunists thrived. Tom scowled. "If those parts are in there, we need proof. I'll call the sheriff." He pulled a battered phone from his pocket, dialing with grease-stained fingers. "We report stolen property. Nothing more, nothing less. Keep it by the book." Within the hour, a county patrol car pulled up, dust billowing. Deputy Ray Mendoza stepped out, mid-30s, lean with a runner's build. He'd grown up in Valencia County, his calm presence shaped by a decade of handling ranch disputes and drug busts. "Got a report of stolen property?" he asked evenly, his eyes flicking to Atlas, who stood bristling but silent. Evan explained quickly, showing the trail and damaged crate. Mendoza knocked on the warehouse door. Minutes later, Vale himself appeared, irritation flashing beneath a mask of charm. "Deputy, what a surprise. If I'd known I had company, I'd have baked a pie." "Cut the jokes," Mendoza replied evenly. "We've got stolen aircraft parts traced here. I need to look inside." For a heartbeat, Evan thought Vale would refuse. But the deputy's steady gaze, and Atlas's low growl, won. Vale gestured grandly. "Of course, deputy. Always happy to cooperate." Inside, the air smelled of oil and dust. Shelves lined the walls, cluttered with machinery. At the back, under a tarp, sat a crate identical to the sabotaged one, this time sealed. Tom ripped it open. Relief washed his face. Inside lay the missing fuel injection pump assembly, untouched. Mendoza gave Vale a long, level look. "We'll call this recovered stolen property. Mr. Rook, Mr. Bradley, file the paperwork. Mr. Vale, mind your inventory." Vale's knuckles whitened on his clipboard. He forced a smirk, but his eyes burned with venom as they flicked toward Evan. Back at the hangar, Nora had been working her own defense. She had tied her black hair into a messy bun, glasses slipping as she spoke rapidly into her laptop camera. "Yes, Mr. Coleman. We're inviting journalists for an exclusive look. You'll see history untouched since 1947. She closed the call and exhaled. If Vale tries intimidation again, the world will already be watching. Dorothy chuckled from her stool, her wiry frame radiating defiance. Smart girl. In the war, if you didn't want trouble in the shadows, you flew high where everyone could see your contrails. Atlas padded by with an extension cord dangling from his mouth, dropping it neatly at Evan's feet. Evan bent, scratching his ears. Good timing, soldier. The very next day would prove how right the shepherd was. The next morning dawned hot and clear, the desert sky polished into an endless blue. Inside the hangar, the team gathered around Molly's promise. Weeks of preparation had led to this, the P-51 Mustang's first engine run. Tom checked gauges one last time. Dorothy stood close, her wrinkled hands steady but her eyes misting. Nora gripped her notepad, trying to appear calm. Atlas planted himself at the hangar doors, ears pricked, as if he knew history was about to stir. Evan climbed into the cockpit. His palms were slick with sweat, his chest tight with anticipation. He flicked the switches. The Merlin engine coughed once, twice, then roared alive. A deep, throaty thunder rattled the hangar, vibrating through the steel beams and into the bones of everyone present. Exhaust filled the air, oil and smoke mingling with the sound of power reborn. The P-51 shuddered, alive again after decades of silence. Then suddenly, darkness. Every light in the hangar snapped off. The Merlin sputtered, coughed, and died. Powers cut. Tom barked, already reaching for a flashlight. Somebody killed the grid. Through the hangar window, Evan glimpsed a truck silhouetted on a distant ridge. A figure stood against the setting sun, Vale, watching. For a moment, panic threatened to choke him. But then he remembered the extension cord Atlas had dropped at his feet the night before. Evan leapt from the cockpit, sprinted to the generator, and yanked its cord. With a cough and growl, the backup engine kicked on. Lights blazed to life. He scrambled back into the Mustang, hit the ignition. The Merlin roared again, this time steady, defiant. Vale's silhouette vanished into the desert. For a moment, no one spoke. Only the sound of the P-51 filled the air, a hymn of resilience. Dorothy's voice broke the silence. She's alive. Evan climbed down, sweat streaking his brow. Atlas pressed against his leg, tail thumping once. Evan placed a hand on the shepherd's back. We keep moving. No matter who tries to stop us. The morning that followed was crisp, the horizon sharp as glass. The Sandia Mountains stood clear and cold, the air carrying the faint scent of juniper and dust. It was the day the sky would remember. Dorothy was the first to climb into a cockpit. At 83, she still carried herself with wiry grace. She wore an olive-green flight suit that fit her like armor, her silver braid tucked neatly beneath her helmet. Before closing the canopy of Molly's promise, she whispered something private against its polished skin. Tom followed, slower but steady, climbing into the P-82 Night Sparrow. His knees creaked, but his hands were sure. He had flown small planes decades ago, but never imagined piloting one of the rarest fighters ever built. Let's see if the old bones remember, he muttered. The third cockpit was taken by Commander Frank Halloway, a retired Navy test pilot in his late 60s. Tall, lean, with salt and pepper hair cropped close, he carried the steady confidence of a man who had spent his life flying prototypes that could kill the careless. He had come out of retirement for this, because Evan needed someone fearless enough to test the Tiger Cat. On the ground, a small crowd had gathered. Reporters Nora had invited stood with cameras ready. Families from the South Valley had brought folding chairs and thermoses of coffee. A handful of veterans leaned on canes at the fence line, their weathered faces glowing with anticipation. Evan stood apart, one hand resting on Atlas's neck. The shepherd leaned against him, tense but silent. Engines cracked the silence. First, the Mustang's Merlin. It built from a growl into a thunder that shook the earth. Dorothy's hands coaxed the throttle, the propeller glinting like a blade in the sun. Then the twin Allisons of Night Sparrow roared awake, their harmonized growl forming a chorus. Last came the Tiger Cat, Frank coaxing its radial engines until they rumbled like an oncoming storm. Atlas barked once, sharp and piercing, as if announcing to the desert, "They are awake." The three Warbirds taxied out onto the makeshift runway, dust curling around their wheels. The crowd held its breath. Dorothy went first. She eased the throttle forward, and the Mustang surged ahead, wheels lifting gracefully into the air. Its silver fuselage caught the morning sun, flashing like lightning. Tom followed, steady and deliberate. The twin Mustangs' dual bodies rose into the sky, slicing the horizon with symmetrical wings. Finally, Frank pushed the Tiger Cat down the strip. The ground shook with raw power before the blue prototype lifted, climbing like a predator set free. Gasps and cheers erupted as the three formed up over the valley, circling in tight formation. Against the backdrop of the Sandias, their silhouettes cut across the blue sky like living thunderbolts. The planes banked together, then swept south over the Rio Grande, their polished skins catching sunlight until they looked like lightning itself. On the ground, Atlas tilted his head back and howled, not in fear, but in eerie harmony with the engines above. The sound sent chills through the crowd. A veteran whispered, tears in his eyes, "Sounds like the boys coming home." Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras clicking non-stop. Children pointed skyward, their faces glowing with awe. Evan simply stood still, Atlas pressed against him. His chest tightened with something he hadn't let himself feel in years, hope. In the sky, Dorothy led the formation in a banking turn. Tom's twin fuselages followed perfectly. Frank's Tiger Cat slid into place with predatory grace. Together they dipped toward the river, then climbed, their echoes rolling across the basin like the drums of war. Minutes later, they lined up for landing. One by one, wheels touched dirt with reverence. Engines shut down, silence falling heavy after so much thunder. The crowd erupted, clapping, cheering, some openly weeping. Veterans saluted. Families waved flags. Reporters shouted questions. Evan stepped forward with Atlas at his side. His face was sunburned, stubbled, but steady. He raised his hand, laid it flat against Atlas's back, and spoke. "No one gets left behind. Not people, not memories, not the courage that built these wings." As if on cue, Atlas lifted his paw and placed it on Evan's hand. The shepherd's tail gave a solemn wag. Cameras clicked. And for the first time in years, Evan smiled. 6 months passed, and the desert seemed to soften under the weight of what had been reborn. What was once a forgotten junkyard on the edge of the Rio Puerco had transformed into something remarkable, the Porter Aviation Heritage Center. Where rust and silence once ruled, now glass-fronted hangars gleamed, skylights spilling sunshine over polished wings. Dirt paths had been paved into walkways where families strolled with cameras, notebooks, and awe. At the heart of it all stood Evan Rook. Once a broken Marine drowning in debt, he now carried himself with steady purpose. He still worked his garage, folded neatly into the East Wing, fixing local trucks and sedans by day. But on weekends, his hands turned to the Warbirds, maintaining the machines that had become his guardianship. The grease still stained his fingers, but the strain that had once lined his face had eased. Atlas, too, had found a new role. The 4-year-old German Shepherd had become the living mascot of the center. His sable coat glistened under the hangar lights, and he wore a simple blue harness, no insignia, no frills. Children followed him eagerly, veterans saluted him with quiet respect. Reporters had dubbed him the Sergeant of Steel, a nickname that stuck. Evan never said it out loud, but the title amused him. Nora Chen, now officially the museum's curator, wove stories through every corner of the exhibits. In her late 20s, with dark hair tied into a practical ponytail and eyes that missed nothing, she arranged galleries that carried both weight and intimacy. One hall displayed Harold Porter's journals, his precise handwriting charting the care he had poured into preserving the aircraft. Another featured photographs sent in by veterans' families, black and white snapshots of young pilots smiling beside their planes, unaware of the decades of silence their machines would endure. Nora had a gift for turning relics into living memory, and visitors left with reverence etched into their hearts. Dorothy, Red Alvarado refused to surrender the sky. On special occasions, she still flew Molly's Promise. The sight of her silver braid whipping in the wind as the Mustang roared overhead became a symbol of resilience. When not flying, she ran workshops for young women, speaking with sharp humor and deep wisdom about strength, loss, and legacy. Veterans leaned close to hear her words. Teenagers laughed at her wit. She had discovered a second youth inside the museum, and she embraced it with fire. Tom Bradley became the machine's guardian. He worked in his corner of the hangar, sleeves rolled, hands black with oil, treating each cable and rivet like sacred trust. He rarely spoke during tours, but when he did, his gravelly voice carried the authority of decades. Local boys once loitering in Albuquerque parking lots now came to him as apprentices, learning patience and respect through the turning of wrenches. Even Commander Frank Halloway returned often. Though he rarely flew, his quiet presence added weight to public events. He gave talks about testing prototypes, about the thin line between innovation and danger. His calm voice, unshaken even when describing aircraft that had nearly killed him, held audiences spellbound. The center thrived. Admissions, donations, and a growing network of enthusiasts kept it solvent. Schools arranged field trips. Veterans groups scheduled reunions. National magazines ran features calling it a shrine of courage and memory. Developers who had once circled like vultures were forced to watch from afar. Graham Vale's name, once whispered in Albuquerque's business circles, had all but vanished. Rumor said he'd left the state entirely. Evenings were quieter for Evan now. He often sat on the porch of the renovated office with Atlas stretched at his feet, the desert breeze carrying the buzz of cicadas. Sometimes he read Porter's journals. Sometimes he simply let the wind wash through him, peace where once there had been only noise. One autumn evening marked the culmination of it all. Families, veterans, reporters, and neighbors gathered in front of the main hangar. Portable lamps glowed warmly against the cooling desert air. A heavy cloth hung over a new sign, waiting to be revealed. Dorothy stood near the front, goggles pushed to her forehead. Tom wiped his hands cleaner than usual, though grease still clung to the lines. Nora clutched her notes but didn't speak, content to let the moment belong to Evan. He stepped forward with Atlas at his side. 6 months ago, he had been a man nearly broken. Now he stood steady, posture firm, softened only by the shepherd leaning close. His voice carried clearly into the desert night. Half a year ago, people said this land was worthless. Today, it's a place of remembrance, of flight, of second chances. My promise to those who flew before us is simple: no memory left behind, no courage melted down into scrap. These wings will keep flying. Their stories will keep living. At his signal, 2 veterans pulled the cord. The cloth fell away, revealing glowing letters. Porter Aviation Heritage Center. Applause erupted, echoing off the hills. Veterans saluted, children waved flags, cameras flashed. Atlas stood squarely beside Evan. Then he lifted his head and barked once, sharp and ringing. The crowd laughed, then cheered louder, some even shouting his name. To them, it wasn't just a bark, it was a declaration, a promise kept. Evan rested his hand over Atlas's head, smiling faintly. His words were quiet, but they carried. The wings have returned to the sky. And we have returned to being human. The sun slipped behind the horizon, leaving the sign glowing and the people warmed by more than light. Sometimes miracles aren't found in gold or jewels. Sometimes they're hidden in what others call worthless. Evan had once thought he inherited nothing but rust. But with a loyal German shepherd, steadfast friends, and the quiet hand of Providence, he had uncovered not junk, but living memorials. And in saving them, he had saved himself. The lesson was clear. What seems forgotten may be the place where hope is buried. What looks broken may carry the seeds of redemption. Second chances are never beyond reach. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs encouragement. Leave a comment with your thoughts. And if you believe no memory and no act of courage should ever be forgotten, type Amen in the comments below. Subscribe for more stories of resilience, faith, and second chances. And may God bless you and your family with strength, peace, and hope each new day.